Deep in the Bavarian countryside, there stands a patch of land, a place where trees now grow wild. It is quiet here, but this quiet is not peaceful. It is a heavy, lingering silence, one that holds a story from 100 years ago. This place was once called Hinterkaifeck. It was a small, isolated farmstead, home to the Gruber family. They lived a simple life, far from the nearest village of Kaifeck. The farm was their entire world. A world that was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. A crime so strange, so chilling, it has haunted Germany for a century. The story of Hinterkaifeck is not just a murder mystery, it is a journey into darkness. The year was 1922. Germany was a nation struggling. The Great War had left deep scars. The country was in turmoil. Economic hardship was everywhere. Political unrest simmered just beneath the surface. It was a time of uncertainty and fear. In this landscape of chaos, life in rural Bavaria continued as it always had. Or so it seemed. The Gruber family were part of this world. They were known to be private people, perhaps a little strange. They kept to themselves. But on their remote farm, something was deeply wrong. Strange events began to happen. Unexplained noises, a set of footprints in the snow leading to the house, but none leading away. A mystery was unfolding long before any blood was shed. Imagine the isolation. The farmstead of Hinterkaifeck was not just a home, it was a fortress of solitude. The nearest neighbors were over a kilometer away. The dense woods that surrounded the property seemed to swallow all sound. It was in this seclusion that the Grubers lived. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was a hard man. His wife Casilia was known to be devout. Their widowed daughter Victoria and her two young children, Casilia and Joseph, also lived there. They had just hired a new maid, Maria Baumgartner. She arrived only hours before the terror began. They were a family unit sealed off from the outside world. And inside this sealed world, a terrible secret was festering. The signs were there, small, unsettling clues that something was amiss. Andreas Gruber told neighbors stories that made little sense at the time. He spoke of hearing footsteps in the attic. He found an unfamiliar newspaper on his property. His house keys disappeared. He checked the locks. He searched the buildings. He found nothing, no one. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. He refused to go to the police. He was a man who handled his own problems. This decision would prove fatal. The family was living on a knife's edge. They were trapped with an unseen presence. A predator was circling their home, waiting for the right moment to strike. The silence of the farmstead was about to be broken by screams. On the evening of Friday, 31st March 1922, the farmstead fell silent for the last time. The family went about their evening chores. The cows were milked, the fire was stoked, the children were put to bed. But they were not alone. Someone else was there. In the shadows, in the barn, an intruder had made the farm their own. What happened next is a matter of grim speculation, pieced together from the evidence left behind. The killer or killers used a pickaxe, a familiar farm tool. It was turned into a weapon of horrific violence. The attack was methodical, it was brutal, it was personal. Each member of the family was lured one by one into the barn. The scene that was discovered days later defies easy description. It was a tableau of pure carnage. 4 bodies were found in the barn. Andreas Gruber, his wife Casilia, his daughter Victoria, and his 7-year-old granddaughter, also named Casilia. They had been stacked on top of one another, covered with hay. Their skulls were smashed. The violence was extreme. It spoke of a cold, calculated rage. The police would later determine they had been killed with savage force. Inside the house, the horror continued. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was found dead in her bedchamber. And in his cot, 2-year-old Joseph, Victoria's son, was also dead. An entire family wiped out. What makes this crime so profoundly disturbing is not just the violence, it is the chilling behavior of the killer afterwards. The evidence showed that whoever committed these acts did not flee immediately. They stayed. For several days, the killer remained at Hinterkaifeck. The cows were milked, the livestock was fed, smoke was seen rising from the chimney. Neighbors who passed by saw that the farm seemed to be running as normal. The killer ate meals in the kitchen, they slept in a bed. They lived amongst the dead, tending to the farm as if it were their own. This detail transforms a brutal murder into something else entirely. It becomes a story of unimaginable nerve and psychological dread. The discovery was made on Tuesday, 4th April. Several days had passed. Little Casilia had been absent from school. The family had not been seen at church on Sunday. Worried neighbors decided to investigate. They walked to the isolated farmstead. They called out. There was no answer. The doors were locked. Peering through a window, they saw nothing. They decided to force their way into the barn. And there, they found the first signs of the massacre. The scene would be forever burned into their memories. The police were called. The investigation began, but from the very start, it was a mess. The crime scene was contaminated. Evidence was lost. The mystery of Hinterkaifeck had begun, and it was already slipping through the fingers of justice. The initial police investigation was chaotic. Dozens of people walked through the crime scene, friends, neighbors, officials. They moved bodies, they touched objects, critical evidence was trampled underfoot. In 1922, forensic science was in its infancy. The concept of securing a crime scene was not what it is today. This early confusion hampered the investigation from the outset. Detectives from Munich arrived to a scene that was already compromised. They were faced with a puzzle that had missing pieces. Who could have done this and why? The motive seemed to be missing. Money was found untouched in the house. Robbery was not the reason. This was something else, something darker. The search for suspects began. The net was cast wide. Over 100 people were interviewed over the years. Traveling salesmen, former farmhands, jilted lovers, even neighbors. The private lives of the Gruber family were put under a microscope. Stories emerged, rumors of incest between Andreas and his daughter Victoria, whispers that little Josef was the product of this forbidden relationship. This dark secret provided a potential motive, a crime of passion or a crime to silence a scandal. One prime suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local man who had been Victoria's lover. He had long claimed to be Josef's father. His behavior after the murders was strange, suspicious even, but nothing could ever be proven. The case grew cold, yet it never truly went away. It became a part of German folklore, a ghost story told in hushed tones, a warning about the darkness that can hide in plain sight. The murder weapon, the pickaxe, was never definitively identified. The heads of the victims were removed during the autopsy and were later lost during the chaos of the Second World War. The farmstead itself was demolished a year after the murders in 1923. It was as if the community wanted to erase the stain of the crime from the landscape. But you cannot demolish a memory. The empty space where the farm once stood became a monument to the mystery, a place of pilgrimage for those obsessed with the case. Today, more than a century later, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain officially unsolved. No one was ever convicted of the crime. The files are closed, but the case is not. It lives on in books, in documentaries, and on the internet. It is a perfect mystery, a locked room with 6 dead bodies, a killer who vanished into thin air. Modern investigators and amateur sleuths continue to pore over the details, hoping to find the one clue that everyone else missed. The case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How can a family be murdered in their own home, with the killer living alongside them for days and no one finds out? The story of Hinterkaifeck is a chilling reminder. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural. They are human, and sometimes they get away with it. To understand the darkness that fell upon Hinterkaifeck, we must first look at the world outside the farm. We must look at Germany. The year 1922 was not a time of peace. It was a time of deep, festering wounds. The Great War, what we now call the First World War, had ended only 4 years earlier. But the conflict had not truly finished. It had simply changed shape. Germany was a defeated nation, grappling with the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty imposed crippling reparations. It stripped the country of territory. It forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. This was a bitter pill for a proud nation to swallow. The new government, the Weimar Republic, was seen as weak. It was born from defeat and revolution. It struggled for legitimacy from its very first day. The political landscape was a battlefield. Extremist groups from both the left and the right fought for control. There were street battles, political assassinations were shockingly common. Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau would be murdered by right-wing extremists just a few months after the Hinterkaifeck killings. This was the atmosphere of the time, an era of violence, instability and paranoia. The old imperial order was gone, but what was replacing it felt fragile and chaotic. People longed for stability. They yearned for a strong leader to restore order. This deep desire for authority would have devastating consequences in the years to come. In this climate of fear, a brutal crime on a remote farm might not have seemed as shocking as it does to us today. Violence was a part of daily life. The new republic was an experiment in democracy. It was a noble idea, but it was an idea struggling to take root in poisoned soil. Many Germans, especially in conservative rural areas like Bavaria, were deeply suspicious of this new government in Berlin. They clung to the old ways. They respected tradition, authority, and the church. The chaos of the cities, the liberal ideas, the political turmoil, it all felt alien and threatening. This disconnect between the modernizing cities and the traditional countryside was a deep fault line running through German society. It created a sense of isolation and mistrust. People felt that the central government could not protect them. They learned to rely on themselves, on their communities, and sometimes to take matters into their own hands. This was the Germany into which the story of Hinterkaifeck unfolds. It was not a stable, peaceful country. It was a nation in a state of profound crisis, a society traumatized by war, crippled by economic hardship, and torn apart by political division. This context is crucial. It helps to explain why a killer might feel they could act with impunity. It helps to explain why the police investigation might have been flawed, and it helps to explain why a community, already on edge, might retreat into silence and suspicion. The murders at Hinterkaifeck did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in a nation holding its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. The darkness on the farm was a reflection of a greater darkness that was spreading across the land. The political turmoil was matched by economic despair. The German economy was in ruins. The war had drained the nation's coffers. The reparations demanded by the Allies were an impossible burden. To pay its debts, the government began printing more and more money. This was a disastrous decision. It led to hyperinflation. The German mark, once a stable currency, became virtually worthless. People's life savings were wiped out overnight. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks in the morning could cost thousands by the evening. This economic chaos created a desperate dog-eat-dog environment. Survival was a daily struggle for millions. The social fabric was tearing apart under the strain. In the cities, hunger was a constant companion. People queued for hours for basic necessities. Food shortages were common. The black market thrived. But in the countryside, the situation was different. Farmers like the Grubers were, in some ways, better off. They had land, they had livestock, they had food. This made them targets. In an age of widespread poverty, a well-stocked farm was a beacon of wealth. It could attract desperate people, hungry people, dangerous people. Vagrants and drifters roamed the countryside looking for work or for an opportunity to steal. The fear of these outsiders was palpable in rural communities. Every stranger was a potential threat. A locked door was not just a precaution, it was a necessity. The Grubers were known to be relatively wealthy. Andreas Gruber was a shrewd farmer. He had managed his land well. He was also known to keep cash hidden on the farm. In a time when bank savings could be erased by inflation, holding physical assets and cash was a wise move. But it was also a dangerous one. It made the family a target for robbery. This is one of the simplest and most enduring theories about the murders. That a robber, or a group of robbers, came to the farm looking for the Grubers' hidden fortune. But this theory has a problem. A significant amount of money and valuables were left untouched in the house after the killings. If robbery was the motive, the killer was not very good at it. This economic desperation fueled a sense of injustice and resentment. Many people felt abandoned by the state. They saw the government as corrupt and incompetent. This created a fertile ground for extremist ideologies. People were looking for someone to blame for their suffering. They found scapegoats in politicians, in foreign powers, and in minority groups. This atmosphere of blame and anger seeped into every corner of society. It poisoned relationships between neighbors. It fostered an environment where violence could erupt with little warning. The struggle for survival made people hard. It made them suspicious. In this harsh world, the lives of a single, isolated family could seem insignificant. Their disappearance might not be noticed for days because everyone was too busy fighting their own battles. Bavaria has always been a unique region of Germany, fiercely independent, deeply conservative, predominantly Catholic. In the 1922, this was more true than ever. While Berlin was experimenting with liberal democracy and cultural revolution, Bavaria clung tightly to its traditions. The authority of the church, the village, and the family patriarch was paramount. People lived their lives according to rules that had been passed down for generations. This was a world away from the political chaos of the capital, or so it seemed. In reality, Bavaria was a hotbed of right-wing nationalist sentiment. It was here that many Germans dreamed of overthrowing the Weimar Republic and restoring a more authoritarian regime. It was a region that prided itself on order. The Gruber family lived within this traditional world. They were part of a small, tight-knit rural community, but they were also outsiders. They were known to be insular and secretive. Andreas Gruber was not well liked. He was seen as arrogant and quarrelsome. He was often involved in legal disputes with his neighbors. Then there were the rumors, the dark whispers about what went on behind the closed doors of Hinterkaifeck. The alleged incestuous relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria was a terrible scandal. In a deeply religious community, such a sin was considered an abomination. It would have made the family social pariahs. It would have isolated them even further from their neighbors. This secret may have been the key to their deaths. This tension between community values and individual secrets is central to the Hinterkaifeck case. In a small village, everyone knows everyone else's business, or they think they do. Secrets are hard to keep, and secrets, once revealed, can have violent consequences. The honor of a family, the reputation of a community, these things were taken very seriously. A scandal like the one surrounding the Grubers could be seen as a stain on the entire village. Was it possible that someone from the community decided to take matters into their own hands, to cleanse the village of this perceived sin? This is a disturbing thought. It suggests the killer was not a stranger but a neighbor, someone they knew, someone they trusted. The power of the patriarch was absolute in this world. Andreas Gruber ruled his family and his farm with an iron fist. He was the law at Hinterkaifeck. This was not unusual for the time. Men were expected to be masters of their own homes. This is why he likely refused to go to the police when strange things started happening. He would have seen it as a sign of weakness. He was a man who solved his own problems. This self-reliance, this stubborn pride may have been his undoing. He underestimated the threat he was facing. He believed he could protect his family. He was wrong. The old ways, the traditions of self-sufficiency and patriarchal authority offered no protection against the methodical, brutal violence that was coming for them. The trauma of the Great War had left an invisible scar on the German psyche. Millions of men had returned from the trenches. They had witnessed unimaginable horrors. They had been trained to kill. They were now trying to readjust to civilian life in a country that seemed broken and ungrateful. Many of them were unemployed. They were angry. They were adrift. Some found a new purpose in paramilitary groups like the Freikorps. These were right-wing militias made up of demobilized soldiers. They were used by the government to crush left-wing uprisings, but they were also a law unto themselves. They were violent, nationalistic, and deeply hostile to the new democratic republic. This brutalization of society is a key part of the historical context. An entire generation of men had become accustomed to violence. Death was no longer a distant concept, it was a familiar reality. The use of extreme force to solve problems was seen by some as not only acceptable but necessary. Could the killer of Hinterkaifeck have been one of these men, a former soldier perhaps, psychologically damaged by the war? Someone for whom killing was no longer a taboo. The methodical nature of the murders, the cold efficiency, the use of a farm tool as a weapon of war, it all hints at a killer who was no stranger to violence. A man who could kill an entire family, including 2 small children, without hesitation. The political climate contributed to this sense of being on edge. People lived in a state of constant anxiety. They feared a communist revolution, they feared a right-wing coup, they feared the economic collapse. This pervasive fear made people suspicious of one another. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Political differences could shatter lifelong friendships. In this atmosphere of mistrust, it was easy for rumors to spread. It was easy for paranoia to take hold. The community around Hinterkaifeck was not immune to this. The strange and secretive nature of the Gruber family would have made them easy targets for suspicion and gossip. They were different. And in a time of fear, being different could be dangerous. Consider the isolation of the Farmstead again, but this time through the lens of a society on edge. The remote location was not just a physical reality, it was a psychological one. The Grubers were cut off from a society that was itself fracturing. They were a tiny island in a sea of turmoil. When the strange events began, the footsteps, the newspaper, the missing keys, they had no one to turn to. The police were dealing with political violence in the cities. The neighbors were wary and suspicious. The family was truly alone. They were trapped with their secrets and their fear, waiting for a threat that they could not understand, from a world that had seemingly gone mad. Life in the German countryside in 1922 was completely different from the busy modern cities. It was, a life ruled by the seasons, not by news headlines about politics. The daily routine was all about hard physical work. From early morning until late at night, people worked the land. There wasn't much time for fun. New inventions were rare. Many farms, like Hinterkaifeck, didn't have electricity. They didn't have telephones. News from the outside world arrived slowly, through newspapers or by people talking. This made people feel very alone. The closest village was like the center of their whole world. The nearest city might as well have been on another planet. Being so cut off changed how people thought and acted. This isolation meant that communities had to take care of themselves. They had their own traditions, their own social rules, their own ways of solving problems. Justice was often handled right there in the community. Arguments were sorted out among neighbors, not by people from outside. Going to the police in the nearest town was only done as a last resort. This unwillingness to involve outsiders is a very important part of the Hinterkaifeck story. Andreas Gruber's choice not to report the strange things happening was typical of how people thought then. He was in charge of his own place. He would deal with it himself. This strong independence, which was good in some ways, created a dangerous blind spot. It allowed a dangerous person to act without being noticed, right under his nose. The lack of ways to communicate also played a deadly role. Today, if a child misses school for a day, a parent might get a text message within hours. In 1922, it took days for anyone to notice that something was wrong. Little Kazilia missed school. The family didn't show up at church. The postman noticed the mail piling up. But each of these signs was seen by itself. It took 4 days for these separate observations to come together into one worrying thought, that something terrible had happened to the Grubers. In those 4 days, the killer had plenty of time to live on the farm, look after the animals, and then disappear without a trace. The isolation of the countryside provided the perfect hiding place for the crime. Finally, this isolation made people deeply suspicious of anything and anyone from outside. Strangers were immediately noticed. Their presence was questioned. This could act as a way for the community to protect itself, but it could also lead to people being wrongly accused and misled. After the murders, suspicion fell on traveling salespeople, homeless people, and former workers who had been in the area. It was easier for the community to believe that the killer was an outsider, someone they didn't know. The other possibility was too awful to think about, that the monster was one of their own. This deep rural isolation is the setting where the tragedy of Hinterkaifeck unfolded.
I feel nauseous, believe me. Never had a lot of shit come easy. Had to work hard, struggle.
Life at Hinterkaifeck was a relentless cycle of labor dictated by the sun and the seasons. The day began before dawn. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, would be the first to rise. At 63, he was a sturdy, weather-beaten man, hardened by a lifetime of working the land. His wife Kazilia, a woman of 72, would follow, her movements slower but just as determined. Their first tasks were in the barn, the heart of the farmstead. The cows needed to be milked, their warm breath misting in the cold morning air. The pigs and chickens needed to be fed, their noises a familiar chorus that signaled the start of another day of toil. This was a world of mud, hay, and animal smells, a life deeply connected to the earth. Their widowed daughter, Victoria, aged 35, would manage the household. She was a central figure on the farm, a bridge between the old generation and the new. She would have been responsible for preparing the morning meal, a simple but hearty affair of bread, milk, and perhaps some cheese. She also cared for her 2 children. There was 7-year-old Kazilia, a schoolgirl on the cusp of understanding the adult world around her. And then there was 2-year-old Joseph, a toddler whose world was confined to the farm and the arms of his mother. Their lives were interwoven with the farm's rhythm, their chores assigned according to their age and ability, learning the ways of the land from their very first steps. The days were long and filled with tasks that never truly ended. After the morning chores, Andreas would head out to the fields. He would plow, sow, or harvest, depending on the time of year. In late March 1922, he would have been preparing the fields for spring planting, his body aching from the strain of the physical work. Kazilia Sr. would likely tend the garden, mend clothes, or help Victoria with preserving food. There was always something to do. Fences to mend, tools to sharpen, stalls to clean. It was a life of constant motion where idleness was a luxury they could not afford. Their survival depended entirely on their own efforts, their resilience, and their ability to work together as a single functional unit. As evening approached, the family would gather again for the final chores. The animals would be brought in from the pastures and settled for the night. The last milking would be done. The family would then share their evening meal in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house. This would have been a rare moment of rest, a brief pause in the endless cycle of work. They would eat in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, the conversation likely sparse and practical, focused on the day's work and the tasks for the morrow. This was the routine, the unvarying pattern of their existence. It was a hard, isolated life, but it was predictable. It was known. But in the final weeks of March 1922, this predictable world began to fray at the edges. Beneath the surface of this rustic, hard-working life, the Gruber family was not a harmonious unit. They were a household bound together not just by blood and labor, but by dark and troubling secrets. The atmosphere within the stone walls of Hinterkaifeck was likely thick with unspoken tensions and resentments. At the center of this was Andreas Gruber himself. He was not a beloved patriarch. Neighbors described him as cantankerous, miserly, and domineering. He ruled his family with an iron will, his authority unquestioned and absolute. His relationship with the community was strained, marked by frequent arguments and legal disputes over land and money. He was a man who made enemies easily and trusted no one. The most corrosive secret was the rumor of incest between Andreas and his daughter Victoria. This was not mere village gossip. The two had been convicted and imprisoned for the crime in 1915. The court case had been a major scandal in the region, bringing shame upon the family name. After their release, Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, was sent to fight in the Great War. He was reported killed in action in France in 1914, though his body was never recovered. Victoria returned to live at Hinterkaifeck with her parents. The whispers started again when she gave birth to her son Joseph in 1919. Many in the village believed Andreas was the father, a sin that would have condemned them in the eyes of the deeply Catholic community. This dark secret isolated the family, turning their farmstead into a fortress against a judgmental world. They kept to themselves, their interactions with neighbors becoming rare and purely functional. Victoria's life was particularly tragic. She was a talented singer and a devout woman, yet she was trapped in a web of scandal and control. She had a known lover, a local farmer named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He believed himself to be Josef's father and wanted to marry Victoria, but Andreas fiercely opposed the match. This created a bitter love triangle, a source of constant conflict and heartache. Victoria was caught between her domineering father, her would-be husband, and the suffocating weight of community condemnation. The children, Kazilia and Josef, grew up in this tense and unhappy environment. Young Kazilia was old enough to sense the discord. She was described as a bright but melancholic child. She would have been aware of the whispers, the cold shoulders in the village, the palpable tension in her own home. Little Joseph was an innocent, unaware of the controversy surrounding his parentage. This web of secrets, shame and conflict created a volatile atmosphere at Hinterkaifeck. It was a pressure cooker of resentment and forbidden desire. This internal turmoil made the family vulnerable. They were already at war with each other and with their community long before an external threat made its presence known. The enemy was not just outside the gates, it was within. In the weeks leading up to the end of March, the familiar patterns of life at Hinterkaifeck began to be disrupted by a series of strange and unnerving events. These were small things at first, incidents that could be easily dismissed, explained away as tricks of the mind or the wind. But they began to accumulate, creating this growing sense of unease, a feeling that the family was no longer alone, that they were being watched by an unseen presence. The first sign was auditory. Andreas Gruber complained to his neighbors of hearing strange noises. He spoke of hearing footsteps coming from the attic, directly above the master bedroom. The sound was distinct, like someone was pacing back and forth in the empty space above. Andreas, being a practical and fearless man, decided to investigate. He armed himself with a pitchfork and climbed the ladder into the dusty, dark attic. He searched every corner, behind every beam and stack of stored hay. He found nothing. There were no signs of a person hiding. There were no footprints in the thick dust other than his own. There was no plausible explanation for the sounds he had heard. He would have checked the roof for damage, for any loose tiles that might have allowed an animal or the wind to create such a noise, but the roof was secure. The mystery remained. He likely tried to put it out of his mind, but the seed of fear had been planted. The sanctity of his home had been breached. Not long after this, another strange object appeared on the property. Lying near the woods on the edge of his land, Andreas discovered a newspaper. This was highly unusual. The Grubers did not subscribe to this particular paper, which was from Munich. No one in the immediate area read it. How had it gotten there? Had a traveler dropped it? It was possible, but the farm was remote, not on a major thoroughfare. The discovery was unsettling. It was another piece of evidence that someone from the outside world, a stranger, had been on their land. It suggested that the presence was not just a sound in the attic, but a physical person, lurking just beyond the family's sight. These incidents began to wear on Andreas. He was a man accustomed to being in control, to understanding his environment completely. Now his world was filled with things he could not explain. The noises in the attic, the mysterious newspaper, they were anomalies, disruptions to the orderly existence he had built. He confided in a few neighbors, his usual gruff demeanor giving way to a hint of confusion and concern. Yet he remained resolute in his decision not to involve the police. He was a man who handled his own affairs. He would not show weakness or fear to the authorities or the community. This stubborn pride, this belief in his own ability to protect his family would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The most chilling and famous of the strange occurrences happened just a few days before the massacre. A late winter storm had blanketed the fields around Hinterkaifeck with a fresh layer of snow. In the morning, as Andreas started his daily chores, he made a deeply disturbing discovery. A single set of footprints was pressed into the clean white snow. They came from the dense woods that bordered the farm's property. The tracks led directly towards the back of the farmhouse. They were the footprints of a man, clear and deliberate. Andreas followed the trail with a growing sense of dread. He expected to find a corresponding set of tracks leading away from the house, but there were none. Think about the implications of this. A person had walked out of the forest, approached the house, and then simply vanished. The footprints stopped at the house. They did not lead away. This meant one of two things. Either the person was still on the property, hiding somewhere in the sprawling collection of buildings, the house, the barn, the engine shed, or they had entered the house itself. Andreas conducted a frantic search. He checked every room, every shed, every corner of the barn. He looked for broken locks, forced windows, any sign of a break-in. He found nothing. The house was secure. The farm buildings were undisturbed, yet the footprints in the snow told an undeniable story. Someone had come, and they had not left. This event transformed the family's vague unease into palpable fear. The threat was no longer a sound or a misplaced object. It was a person, an intruder who had managed to get incredibly close, undetected. The family was now living with the terrifying knowledge that a stranger could be hiding in the shadows of their own home. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the barn would have taken on a sinister new meaning. The isolation of the farm, once a source of privacy, now felt like a trap. They were cut off, alone with an invisible enemy who knew their property and was biding their time. The psychological pressure on the family must have been immense. Despite this terrifying development, Andreas Gruber still did not go to the police. This decision remains one of the most baffling aspects of the case. Perhaps his distrust of authority was so profound that he felt he would not be believed. Perhaps the shame of his family's secrets made him unwilling to invite official scrutiny into his life. Or perhaps in his pride, he still believed he could handle the situation himself. He likely double-checked the locks, barred the doors at night, and kept a watchful eye. But he was looking for an intruder who was already inside the walls, someone who had made the farmstead their own secret home. The family was living on borrowed time, sleeping under the same roof as their future killer. The series of unsettling events continued to escalate. Following the discovery of the footprints in the snow, another crucial item went missing. A set of house keys disappeared. This was a significant blow. In a home where security had suddenly become a matter of life and death, the loss of the keys was a disaster. It meant that the intruder, who they already suspected was hiding on the property, now potentially had free access to the house itself. The locks, which had offered a thin veneer of safety, were now useless. The family was utterly exposed. The psychological torment of this development is hard to overstate. They were no longer just being watched, they were defenseless. The disappearance of the keys confirmed that the intruder was not just a phantom. They were real, they were close, and they were actively manipulating the family's environment. This was a form of psychological warfare. The unseen tormentor was peeling away the family's sense of security layer by layer. First the noises, then the newspaper, then the footprints, and now the keys. Each incident was designed to increase their fear and isolation. It suggests a killer who was not acting on a sudden impulse, but one who was engaged in a cruel and calculated game. They were enjoying the family's terror, savoring the power they held over them before delivering the final fatal blow. Imagine the paranoia that must have gripped the household. Who could they trust? The keys could have been misplaced, but in the context of the other events, that seemed unlikely. Had one of them been careless, or had the keys been stolen from right under their noses? They would have searched everywhere, their panic growing with every passing moment. The loss of the keys would have been a constant, gnawing source of anxiety. Every night, as they barred the doors, they would know that the locks were meaningless. The intruder could potentially walk in at any moment. They were prisoners in their own home, held captive by an invisible jailer. This was the final warning, the last and most direct sign that the family was in imminent danger. Yet even at this point, no help was sought from the outside world. This remains the most tragic and perplexing part of the prelude to the murders. Andreas Gruber's stubborn refusal to seek help sealed his family's fate. He had multiple opportunities to alert the authorities, to bring others into the situation who might have been able to help. But he chose to face the threat alone. He, a man in his 60s, along with his elderly wife, his daughter and 2 small children. They were no match for the cunning and ruthless predator who was now methodically preparing to annihilate them. The stage was set for the final horrific act. The last day of March, 1922, dawned cold and grey over Hinterkaifeck. It was a Friday. For the Gruber family, the day began like any other, with the familiar rhythm of farm chores. But you know, the underlying tension must have been just unbearable. They were living with the constant fear of an intruder, now possibly armed with their own house keys. On that day, a new person arrived at the farm. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, came to start her first day of work. Her sister had walked with her to the edge of the property, and she was one of the last people to see any of the residents alive. Maria was stepping into a house that was already a tomb in waiting, completely unaware of the strange events and the palpable fear that had preceded her arrival. It's honestly heartbreaking to consider Maria's fate. She was 44 years old, and this was supposed to be a new chapter in her life. She was likely nervous, but, hopeful about her new position. She would have been introduced to the family, shown to her room, and given her first tasks. She had no connection to their secrets, no part in their conflicts. She was an innocent bystander who had the profound misfortune of arriving at Hinterkaifeck on the very day the killer chose to strike. Her presence did not deter the attacker. Instead, she was simply added to the list of victims, another life to be extinguished in the coming slaughter. Her arrival marks the final piece falling into place before the tragedy unfolded. As the afternoon wore on, the family went about their business. Young Kazilia returned from school for the last time. Neighbors reported seeing members of the family in the yard during the day. Everything appeared normal from a distance. But inside, the family was preparing for another night of fear. As darkness fell, they would have performed their evening chores, their senses on high alert. Every shadow, every sound would have been a potential threat. They gathered for their final meal, a small group of people bound together by fear, huddled in the kitchen against the encroaching night and the unknown terror that was with them. They were completely unaware that these were their last moments together. Police later theorized what happened next. The killer, who had likely been hiding in the barn for days, waited patiently. They knew the family's routine intimately. They chose their moment with cold precision. The theory suggests that one by one, members of the family were lured from the relative safety of the house out to the barn. Perhaps a noise was made, simulating a problem with the livestock. Andreas, as the head of the household, would have gone to investigate first. Then perhaps his wife, Kazilia, followed when he did not return. Then Victoria, and finally young Kazilia, each one walking into a trap from which they would not escape. The silence of the night was about to be broken. The farmstead of Hinterkaifeck fell quiet. After the brutal events of Friday, the 31st of March, an unnatural stillness descended upon the property. The killer, however, did not flee. This is honestly one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. For several days, an unknown person remained at the farm, living amongst the bodies of their victims. The evidence for this is undeniable and deeply unsettling. Smoke was seen curling from the chimney, a sign that someone was keeping the home fires burning. This was noticed by neighbors and passers-by. From a distance, it seemed as though life at Hinterkaifeck was continuing as normal. No one suspected the horror that lay within. The livestock, a farmer's most precious asset, were not neglected. The cows in the barn were milked each day. The other animals were fed and tended to. Someone was performing the daily chores of the Gruber family. They were following the rhythm of the farm as if it were their own. They moved through the house and the barn, stepping around the dead to keep the farm running. This detail transforms the crime from a simple, violent outburst into a calculated and psychologically terrifying performance. The killer was not just a murderer. They were an imposter, playing the role of the farmer while the real family lay dead nearby. Inside the house, further signs of the killer's extended stay were found. Food had been eaten from the kitchen pantry, bread was cut, meat had been consumed. The killer had prepared meals for themselves, sitting in the very heart of the home they had just destroyed. It's a detail that almost defies belief. The sheer nerve required to do this is staggering. They must have slept in one of the beds, possibly even the bed of one of their victims, while the bodies of the family decomposed just meters away. For at least 3 days, from Friday night until sometime before Tuesday, the killer made Hinterkaifeck their own private kingdom of the dead. The outside world remained oblivious. Saturday passed, Sunday came and went. The Grubers, known for their devoutness, were absent from church. This was noted, but perhaps not seen as a major cause for alarm just yet. The postman arrived on Saturday and found no one to take the mail. He left it on the windowsill. Young Kazilia did not attend school on Monday, the 3rd of April. Her absence was marked. These were all small, disconnected pieces of a puzzle. No one had yet put them together to see the dreadful picture they were forming. The isolation of the farm worked in the killer's favor, granting them a precious window of time to live with their crime before vanishing. By Tuesday, the 4th of April, the small signs of absence had grown into a chorus of concern. The accumulated mail, the missed church service, the school absence, it was just too much to ignore. A coffee salesman named Hans Shirovsky had tried to visit the farm on that Tuesday to complete an order, but no one answered his calls. Later that day, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor and Victoria's former lover, decided to act. He had sent his son Johann to the farm to see if he could make contact with the family, but the boy returned having seen no one. Schlittenbauer gathered 2 other men, Michael Paul and Jakob Siegel. Together, the 3 of them walked the kilometer to the silent, waiting farmstead. The men arrived in the late afternoon. An eerie quiet hung over the property. They called out the family's names: Andreas, Victoria, Kazilia. The only response was the wind and the lowing of hungry cattle from the barn. They checked the house, but all the doors were locked. Peering through the windows, they could see nothing out of the ordinary. The men decided their next move, they would check the barn. The large doors were also locked, but they found a way to force one of them open. They slid the heavy door back, and the musty, dark interior was revealed. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, the first awful sight confronted them. There, lying in the hay, was a scene of unimaginable horror. 4 bodies brutally slain. They were partially covered with hay, and a door had been laid over them as if in a crude attempt to hide the crime. The men recognized them immediately. It was Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, and the 7-year-old granddaughter, also Kazilia. Their heads were bloodied and smashed. The men were stunned, frozen by the horrific tableau. They realized they were standing in the middle of a slaughterhouse. Their first thought was for the other 2 family members, the maid and the little boy, Josef. They backed out of the barn, their minds reeling from the discovery. Schlittenbauer and his companions rushed back to the main house. This time they smashed a window to gain entry. They moved through the silent rooms, calling out the names of the missing. In the maid's bedchamber, just off the kitchen, they found Maria Baumgartner. She was dead in her bed, her head also bearing the marks of extreme violence. Finally, they entered Victoria's bedroom. There, in his little cot, lay 2-year-old Joseph. He too had been killed. The entire family and their new maid had been wiped out. The ghastly discovery was complete. The men stumbled out of the house into the cold April air, their minds forever scarred by what they had seen. The long silence of Hinterkaifeck had been broken, replaced by the impending scream of a police siren. The news of the massacre, well, it spread like wildfire through the small rural community. Lorenz Schlittenbauer and the others raced back to the village to raise the alarm. Before long, the police from the nearby town of Schrobenhausen were notified. But in the hours between the discovery and the arrival of the first officers, a critical error was made. The farmstead was not secured. Word of the horror at Hinterkaifeck drew a crowd. Neighbors, local dignitaries, and, morbidly curious onlookers flocked to the property. They walked through the house. They tramped through the barn. They wanted to see the scene for themselves. In their shock and disbelief, these people inadvertently destroyed a vast amount of potential evidence. They touched surfaces, moved objects, and contaminated the entire crime scene with countless footprints and fingerprints. The bodies themselves were disturbed before the police could examine them in their original positions. This was not done out of malice, it was really just a product of the time, an era before the strict protocols of modern forensic science were established. But the result was catastrophic for the investigation. The killer had been granted days to escape, and now the scene of their crime was being irreparably compromised by the very community they had terrorized. When the first police officers arrived, they were faced with a scene of utter chaos. The farm was swarming with people. They struggled to establish control and clear the area. The initial examination of the bodies and the surroundings was conducted in a haphazard manner. The focus was on the shocking nature of the violence, not on the meticulous collection of trace evidence. The murder weapon, believed to be a pickaxe or mattock belonging to the family, was found in the barn near the bodies. It was handled by several people before being secured as evidence. The chance to find a clean fingerprint belonging to the killer was likely lost in these first chaotic hours. Detectives from the Munich Police Department were called in to lead the investigation. They arrived the following day on Wednesday, the 5th of April. They were skilled investigators for their time, but they were already at a significant disadvantage. The crime scene was a mess. Key evidence may have already been lost forever. They began the painstaking process of interviewing witnesses and trying to reconstruct the events. They noted the signs that the killer had stayed on the farm, the milked cows, the eaten food. This bizarre detail was one of the few clear clues they had, but it raised more questions than answers. What kind of person would do this? The investigation had begun, but it was on a foundation of confusion and contaminated evidence. The official investigation, led by Inspector Georg Reingruber and his team from Munich, immediately focused on finding a motive. The most obvious motive for such a crime is robbery. The Grubers were known to be reasonably well off and to keep cash in the house. However, this theory quickly fell apart. A search of the home uncovered a significant amount of money in gold marks, as well as other valuables, like jewelry and silver coins. They were all untouched. If the killer had been a common thief, they had done a very poor job of it. Robbery was ruled out as the primary motive, forcing the police to look for a more personal, more complex reason for the slaughter. With robbery dismissed, the investigation turned towards the family's private life. Detectives began to interview neighbors and acquaintances, and the dark secrets of the Grubers started to surface. The story of the incest conviction and the disputed parentage of young Josef became central to the police inquiry. This opened up a new avenue of suspicion. Could the crime have been one of passion or revenge? Perhaps someone wanted to silence the family to prevent a scandal from spreading further, or maybe it was an act of vengeance related to the family's internal conflicts. The focus shifted from an unknown outsider to someone who knew the Grubers intimately. This led the police to their first major suspect, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. As Victoria's lover and the man who claimed to be Josef's father, he had a clear connection to the family's turmoil. His behavior on the day of the discovery was also seen as strange. He seemed unusually calm and had disturbed the bodies in the barn, claiming he was looking for his son. Some wondered if he had staged the discovery. Schlittenbauer was questioned extensively. He had a motive, and his proximity to the farm gave him opportunity. However, he had an alibi for the time of the murders, and despite the deep suspicion that would follow him for the rest of his life, the police could never find enough concrete evidence to charge him with the crime. The initial autopsies were conducted on the farm a day after the discovery. The court physician, Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller, examined the bodies in the barn. He concluded that the victims' skulls had been smashed with a blunt instrument, likely the pickaxe found at the scene. He also noted that young Casilia had survived the initial attack for several hours, tearing out clumps of her own hair in terror as she lay next to the bodies of her family. In a decision that would haunt the case forever, the heads of the victims were removed and sent to Munich for further examination by clairvoyants. This bizarre step highlights the desperation of the investigators. Tragically, the heads were later lost during the chaos of the Second World War, another piece of the puzzle gone forever. The brutal murder of 6 people, including 2 children, sent a shockwave of terror through the entire region. Hinterkaifeck was no longer just a name on a map. It was a symbol of incomprehensible violence. In the small villages surrounding the farm, doors were bolted at night. People looked at their neighbors with a new sense of suspicion. The initial theory of a wandering vagrant had been frightening enough. But as the police investigation hinted at a killer with a personal motive, the fear became more intimate. The monster was not some faceless outsider. They were likely someone from the community, someone they knew, someone they saw every day. This pervasive fear created an atmosphere of silence and mistrust. While some people spoke to the police, others were reluctant. They feared reprisal from the killer, who was still at large. They also feared becoming suspects themselves. Old grudges and village disputes were seen in a new, sinister light. Anyone who had ever had an argument with the quarrelsome Andreas Gruber was now under a cloud of suspicion. The community, once bound by shared traditions, began to fracture under the weight of the unsolved crime. The whispers and accusations poisoned the social well, creating divisions that would last for generations. The press seized upon the story. Newspapers across Germany reported on the Hinterkaifeck murder farm. The gruesome details of the crime, combined with the scandalous rumors about the family, made for sensational reading. The case captivated the public's imagination. It was a real-life horror story unfolding in the quiet Bavarian countryside. The intense media attention put immense pressure on the police to find a culprit. They pursued dozens of leads, interviewing over 100 suspects in the years that followed. They investigated former farmhands, jilted lovers, and even Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who was officially declared dead. On the wild theory, he had returned from the war to seek revenge. Despite the massive investigation, every lead eventually grew cold. No one was ever charged with the murders. The killer of Hinterkaifeck had seemingly committed the perfect crime and vanished. For the community, there was no closure. The fear slowly subsided, but it was replaced by a lasting sense of unease. The farmstead itself was seen as a cursed place. A year after the murders, in 1923, the buildings were demolished. The wood was burned, the foundations filled in. It was a desperate attempt to erase the physical reminder of the tragedy. But the memory could not be demolished. The story of Hinterkaifeck became a local legend, a ghost story whispered to children, a permanent scar on the soul of the community. Of all the suspects in the Hinterkaifeck case, none has attracted more suspicion over the century than Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was not just a neighbor. His life was deeply entangled with the Gruber family. Schlittenbauer was a well-respected farmer and the recently widowed mayor of the local village. He had engaged in a long and complicated love affair with Victoria Gruber. He firmly believed himself to be the biological father of her 2-year-old son, Josef, and had even signed the boy's birth certificate and paid maintenance. His desire to marry Victoria was an open secret in the community, a plan that was consistently thwarted by her domineering father, Andreas Gruber. This set the stage for a classic motive, a man driven to extreme measures by love, jealousy, and frustration. Schlittenbauer's actions on the day the bodies were discovered only deepened the cloud of suspicion that hung over him. He was the one who organized the search party, and he was one of the first to enter the horrific scene in the barn. His behavior was described by the other men as strangely composed, almost unnervingly so. He disturbed the crime scene significantly, moving the bodies and the hay that covered them, claiming he was searching for his son, Josef. Later, when the house was entered, he seemed to know his way around with an unusual familiarity. These actions could be interpreted as the panic of a grieving man, or as the calculated moves of a guilty one trying to obscure his tracks. The ambiguity of his behavior made him an immediate and enduring person of interest for the police. Investigators questioned Schlittenbauer extensively, probing his alibi and his relationship with the Grubers. He claimed to have been at home with his children on the night of the murders, an alibi that was difficult to either confirm or refute conclusively in such a small, isolated community. He also made strange statements to others in the days following the crime, remarks that seemed to hint at some hidden knowledge. For years, rumors circulated that he confessed to the crime on his deathbed, though no concrete proof of this has ever emerged. He remained the prime suspect in the eyes of many of his neighbors, living out his life under a shadow of guilt, a man forever tied to the massacre at the farm next door. The case against Schlittenbauer is compelling, but entirely circumstantial. The motive is clear. If Andreas and Victoria were removed, he could have potentially taken over the farm and raised the child he believed was his son. His opportunity was undeniable, as he lived just a short distance away and knew the farm's layout intimately. Yet for every suspicious action, there is a plausible, innocent explanation. Was his composure a sign of guilt, or the stoicism of a man accustomed to the harsh realities of rural life and death? Did he disturb the scene to cover his tracks, or in a desperate, frantic search for the woman he loved and their child? Without a confession or a single piece of physical evidence, the theory remains just that, a dark and persistent theory. Another compelling and almost cinematic theory revolves around a figure who was supposed to be dead. Karl Gabriel was Victoria Gruber's husband and the legal father of her daughter, Casilia. He had been a soldier in the Great War and was officially reported as killed in action on the battlefields of France in December 1914. His body, however, was never recovered, a common occurrence in the brutal chaos of trench warfare. This lack of a body left a sliver of doubt, a small opening for a truly startling possibility. What if Karl Gabriel had not died? What if he had survived the war, perhaps as a prisoner of war in Russia, and had finally made his way back to Bavaria in 1922? This theory paints a grim picture of a soldier returning home not to a hero's welcome, but to a devastating betrayal. Imagine a man brutalized by war, traveling for years to get back to his family, only to find his wife in an incestuous relationship with her father, and to discover that she had borne another child, Josef, who was widely believed to be the product of this union. In the post-war era, where honor and reputation were paramount and many men were psychologically scarred by violence, such a discovery could easily trigger a homicidal rage. The methodical and brutal nature of the killings, some have argued, is consistent with a soldier trained to kill, carrying out a vengeful, cold-blooded execution of the family who shamed him. There is some circumstantial evidence to support this ghostly theory. Several people came forward after the murders to claim they had encountered a man who matched Karl Gabriel's description in the area. A fellow soldier even claimed to have met Gabriel in 1918, after he was officially declared dead, and that Gabriel had spoken of deserting to Russia. Furthermore, Russian prisoners of war who were released after the war sometimes took years to make the long journey home. The timeline, while tight, is not impossible. The idea of Gabriel hiding out on the farm, learning the family's secrets before striking, would explain the strange occurrences leading up to the crime, such as the footsteps in the attic and the vanishing keys. Despite its narrative power, the Karl Gabriel theory rests on a foundation of speculation. There is no definitive proof that he was alive after 1914. The sightings were unconfirmed and could have been cases of mistaken identity. It is a theory born from the lack of other clear suspects and the desire for a motive that could explain such extreme violence. It provides a neat, if horrifying, solution to the puzzle. The avenging husband returning from the dead. However, without any concrete evidence placing him at or even near Hinterkaifeck in March 1922, Karl Gabriel remains a phantom, a ghost, haunting the edges of the mystery rather than a solid suspect. The police investigated this possibility but ultimately could not substantiate it, leaving it as one of the most intriguing what-ifs of the case. In the chaotic and impoverished landscape of post-war Bavaria, the countryside was rife with desperate people. Vagrants, drifters, unemployed laborers, and escaped criminals roamed the land searching for food, work, or an opportunity to steal. For the isolated communities of the hinterland, these outsiders were a constant source of fear and suspicion. It was natural then that one of the earliest theories pointed the finger at an unknown attacker, a faceless drifter who stumbled upon the remote and seemingly wealthy farmstead of Hinterkaifeck. This theory suggested that the motive was simple robbery which went horribly wrong, resulting in the slaughter of the entire family. The initial appeal of this theory was its simplicity. It did not require deep knowledge of the Gruber family's dark secrets or local village politics. It imagined a killer, or perhaps a small group of killers who saw the farm as an easy target. They could have been watching the property for days, which would explain the footsteps in the newspaper. Perhaps they were hiding in the barn, waiting for the right moment to strike. The brutal efficiency of the murders could be explained by the desperation of hungry men who were willing to do anything to get what they wanted. This explanation was, in many ways, less terrifying to the local community than the idea that the killer was one of their own, living amongst them. However, the robbery theory has one major glaring flaw. Nothing of significant value was stolen. The police found a large cache of money and valuables completely untouched within the house. If the goal was robbery, the killers were spectacularly unsuccessful. Why would they go to the trouble of murdering 6 people, including 2 small children, and then leave the loot behind? Furthermore, the killer's behavior after the crime, remaining on the farm for days, tending the livestock and eating the family's food, doesn't align with the typical actions of a thief who would want to flee the scene as quickly as possible. These details suggest a motive far more personal and complex than a simple smash and grab. Despite these contradictions, the police did pursue several leads involving outsiders. They investigated former farmhands who had been dismissed by the notoriously difficult Andreas Gruber. They looked into known criminals who were active in the region at the time. One particularly sad case involved 2 men who had been seen in the area and were later arrested in Silesia for other murders. They were questioned about Hinterkaifeck, but no link could be established. Ultimately, the outsider theory crumbles under the weight of the evidence found at the scene. The crime felt personal. The killer's lingering presence suggested a bizarre sense of ownership or comfort in the home, something that points away from a random stranger and towards someone with a deeper, darker connection to the farm. Beyond the main suspects, the Hinterkaifeck case is littered with bizarre leads and theories that, really highlight the desperation of the investigators and the mystique the case has generated over the years. One of the strangest avenues pursued by the original detectives actually involved the use of paranormal methods. In a move that seems almost unbelievable today, the heads of the victims were severed during the autopsy and sent to Munich to be examined by clairvoyants. It was hoped that these psychics could somehow glean information about the killer from the remains. This resort to the supernatural just underscores how few rational leads the police had and how the case was pushing the boundaries of conventional investigation from the very beginning. Another odd theory centered on the engine in the farm's engine shed. It had recently been repaired, and according to one story, the mechanic who fixed it told Andreas Gruber that the engine was making strange, almost human-like noises. Some have speculated that the killer might have been hiding in the engine shed and that the sounds were related to their presence. Another, more outlandish version of this story suggests a political motive. The mechanic supposedly belonged to a paramilitary organization, and the murder was somehow connected to secret political activities or hidden weapons on the farm. Like many theories in this case, it's a thread of speculation that ultimately leads nowhere concrete, but adds to the rich tapestry of mystery surrounding the events. The case has also been a magnet for confessions over the decades, though none have ever been substantiated. Years after the murders, a prisoner on his deathbed allegedly confessed to the crime, providing details that seemed to match the evidence. However, upon investigation, his story fell apart and it was dismissed as a final, desperate bid for notoriety. The sheer number of suspects investigated, over 100 in the initial years, shows how widely the police cast their net. They looked at everyone from jilted lovers of Victoria to neighbors who had argued with Andreas over property lines. The killer seemed to be both everywhere and nowhere, a ghost who left a trail of carnage but no clear identity. In 2007, a group of students at the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy took on the Hinterkaifeck case as a final year project, applying modern criminal profiling and investigative techniques. After months of poring over the old files, they concluded that it was impossible to definitively solve the crime after so much time had passed and so much evidence had been lost. However, they did come to a consensus on a single prime suspect, but chose not to name the person out of respect for their living relatives. This tantalizing conclusion only adds another layer to the enduring enigma. The case remains a perfect mystery, a puzzle box with missing pieces where every theory seems plausible yet unprovable, leaving the truth forever lost in the shadows of 1922. The immediate aftermath of the Hinterkaifeck murders left a deep and permanent scar on the local community. The farmstead itself became a place of immense dread, a monument to a crime that was just, too horrific to comprehend. No one wanted to live there. No one wanted to work the land that had been soaked in so much blood. The remaining livestock was sold off, and the farm buildings were left empty, standing silent against the Bavarian sky. They became a dark landmark, a place for morbid curiosity seekers to visit. Their presence a constant, painful reminder for the villagers of what had happened in their midst. The silence that returned to the farm was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of an unsolved atrocity. Just over a year after the killings in 1923, the decision was made to demolish the entire farmstead. The house, the barn, the sheds, everything was torn down. The timber was burned and the foundations were filled with earth. It was a communal act of erasure, a desperate attempt to wipe the physical stain of the crime from the landscape. The community wanted to move on. They hoped that by removing the buildings, they could also remove the memory and the fear that lingered. But a memory is not so easily demolished. The act of destruction only transformed the site into something else, a void, an empty space that spoke volumes about the horror it once held. The scar was not healed. It was simply covered over. The land where Hinterkaifeck once stood was eventually reforested. Trees were planted, and nature was allowed to reclaim the plot. Today there is little to see but a quiet copse of trees and a small, simple memorial shrine erected in 1979. Yet the place has never lost its chilling aura. It has become a destination for dark tourists, amateur sleuths, and those fascinated by the macabre. They walk the ground trying to feel a connection to the past, searching for clues that were missed a century ago. The physical farm is gone, but the ghost of it remains, drawing people in. The empty space is more powerful than any building could be, a testament to a family erased and a killer who was never caught. For the people of the surrounding villages, especially the older generations, the story was never just a story, it was a part of their local history, a dark chapter they lived with every day. The suspicion that the killer was one of their own poisoned relationships for decades. Families were divided by accusations. Friendships were broken by mistrust. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the prime suspect, lived out his life in the community, forever marked by the unsolved crime. The murders created invisible fault lines that ran through the village, a legacy of fear and suspicion that was passed down through the generations. The scar on the landscape was mirrored by a scar on the soul of the community itself. The story of Hinterkaifeck has grown far beyond the small Bavarian community where it happened. It has become one of Germany's most famous and enduring true crime legends. The case has a unique grip on the national psyche, a chilling power that has not faded with time. It embodies a particular kind of fear, the terror of the familiar turned monstrous. The murder weapon was a common farm tool. The killer lived among the dead, tending to the animals. The crime happened not in a dark alley in a big city, but in the supposed safety of a family home in the heart of the idyllic countryside. This subversion of the pastoral ideal is what makes the story so deeply unsettling. Over the decades, the murders have been the subject of countless books, articles, television documentaries, and even feature films. Each new telling of the story introduces the horror to a new generation, ensuring that the mystery is never forgotten. The case has become a kind of national ghost story, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a placid facade. It taps into primal fears about isolation, betrayal, and the unknown. The fact that it remains unsolved is crucial to its power. It allows for endless speculation, turning every reader or viewer into a detective, sifting through the same sparse clues and coming to their own conclusions. The case also serves as a dark mirror, reflecting the anxieties of the time in which it occurred. The violence, the social breakdown, the failure of authority, these were all features of the Weimar Republic. The chaos at Hinterkaifeck can be seen as a microcosm of the chaos that was engulfing the entire nation. The story's persistence in German culture may be partly because it encapsulates the trauma and instability of that era. It is a reminder of a dark period in the country's history, a time when the world seemed to have gone mad, and unimaginable violence could erupt in the most unexpected of places. It is a mystery rooted not just in a specific crime, but in a specific moment of history. For modern Germans, the case is a fascinating, if terrifying, puzzle. It is a historical cold case that feels strangely immediate. The internet has given it a new life, with forums and websites dedicated to dissecting every shred of evidence. Amateur detectives from around the world collaborate, translating old documents and proposing new theories. This ongoing collective investigation keeps the memory of the Gruber family alive. It transforms them from distant historical figures into victims whose story still demands justice. The haunting of Hinterkaifeck is not just about ghosts in a field. It is about the way a violent, unsolved crime can lodge itself in a nation's collective memory and refuse to let go. A century later, the question remains, why has the Hinterkaifeck case never been solved? The answer lies in a perfect storm of circumstances that doomed the investigation from the very beginning. The first and most critical failure was the contamination of the crime scene. In the hours and days after the discovery, dozens of people tramped through the house and barn, destroying invaluable forensic evidence. Fingerprints were smudged, footprints were obscured, and the killer's trail was hopelessly muddied. In an era before DNA analysis, the physical evidence was paramount. And in this case, it was largely lost before it could even be properly collected. The investigation started on the back foot and never recovered. The second major factor was the isolation of the farm and the 4-day gap between the murders and their discovery. This gave the killer an enormous head start. They had ample time to live on the farm, establish an alibi, and then disappear without a trace. By the time the police from Munich arrived, the trail was ice cold. Furthermore, the lack of modern communication technology meant that witness accounts were gathered slowly and were often contradictory. The police were trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces and a distorted picture, relying on the fallible memories and potential biases of a small, fearful community where rumors were rife. The nature of the community itself also presented a challenge. The deep-seated secrets, the family shame, and the suspicion between neighbors created an environment where people were likely reluctant to speak openly to outside authorities. The police had to navigate a complex web of local relationships, grudges, and loyalties. It's highly probable that someone in the community knew more than they let on. Perhaps they suspected a neighbor but kept silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty. Perhaps they held the key to the motive but were too afraid or ashamed to come forward. The killer was protected, intentionally or not, by a wall of rural silence. Ultimately, Hinterkaifeck may be destined to remain an eternal mystery. The main suspects are long dead. The physical evidence is gone, the victims' heads lost to the chaos of another war. Even the 2007 Police Academy review, with all its modern techniques, could only point to a probable suspect, not offer definitive proof. The case has become a textbook example of an unsolvable crime, and perhaps that is the source of its terrifying, enduring legacy. It is a story without an ending, a wound that has never closed. It reminds us that sometimes, despite our best efforts, the truth can be lost to the past, and monsters can get away with murder, leaving only questions and a lingering chill behind them. story of Hinterkaifeck ends where it began, in silence. A century has passed since the PICKAXE fell, yet the questions that arose in the spring of 1922 remain unanswered. Who was the figure who walked from the woods and never walked back? What motive could fuel such a methodical and merciless slaughter of an entire family? The case is a chilling tapestry woven from threads of fact, rumor and fear. We have the brutal reality of the crime, the 6 bodies in the barn and the house. We have the strange prelude of footsteps and missing keys. And we have the haunting postscript of a killer who lingered, living amongst the dead before vanishing into the mists of history. It is a narrative that defies simple explanation, leaving us in a state of perpetual uncertainty, which is perhaps the most unsettling conclusion of all. The enduring power of this mystery lies in its perfect ambiguity. Every theory, from the spurned lover to the avenging husband, seems plausible yet remains stubbornly unprovable. The catastrophic loss of evidence in the first hours of the investigation ensured that the truth would likely stay buried with the victims. This lack of resolution has transformed the case from a local tragedy into a piece of international folklore, a benchmark for the term unsolved. It challenges our belief in justice and order, reminding us that sometimes the most horrific acts go unpunished. The killer of Hinterkaifeck lived out their life, carrying their terrible secret to the grave, achieving a terrifying victory over society's attempts to hold them accountable. This is the ultimate horror of the tale. Looking forward, the chances of a definitive resolution are almost non-existent. The key players are long gone. The physical evidence has vanished. Modern science can offer no new miracles on a trail that went cold 100 years ago. The only place the investigation can continue is in the realm of historical analysis and speculation. Perhaps the students of the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy were right, that the killer's identity is hidden in plain sight within the old files, a secret protected by the passage of time. But without proof, it remains just another theory. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck is therefore not one of resolution, but of remembrance. It is a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk in isolated places and the secrets that can fester behind closed doors. The cultural significance of the Hinterkaifeck murders is now cemented. It is more than just a cold case, it is a profound human drama that continues to captivate and terrify. The story forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that some questions will never have answers, that some crimes are and will remain perfect. The silence that fell over the farmstead on that final Friday in March 1922 has, in a way, never been broken. It echoes down through the decades. A quiet, persistent reminder of 6 lives brutally taken and of a shadow that got away. The tale of Hinterkaifeck is a chilling testament to the fact that sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones that have no end.